Well, Kevin, what do you say we just we get started?
Let's get started.
Yeah, because I like this training. I'm excited about it. We have Matt with us. We got Lincoln and Megan, and so it's a good thing for all of us to learn through and talk about together.
Agreed. All right, Ryan, let's go.
Okay, so the subject is critical thinking. We talked about this last month. We had just a really great response from students on the subject of critical thinking in child welfare. And so we decided to make it more of a series where we talk about just different elements of the topic, kind of looking at it from a big picture down to people's individual roles in social work, child welfare specifically. In the chat area here in Zoom, if you would just either drop a definition or what your definition is of critical thinking, and think of it in light of child welfare, or you can unmute and you're welcome to just say what you think critical thinking is.
So nobody has a clue what critical thinking is.
Oh, here we go. Matt Hill, thank you. We appreciate your engagement. It's one of those things, Kevin, I think that critical thinking sort of says what it is, right? But if we really start thinking about it, we kind of need some time to type it out. So Matt wrote, evaluating internally for external situations that may impact ethics. Okay, I like that Matt brought up ethics. Kevin, what do you think about that?
That was very good, Matt. I appreciate, number one, you touched on the internal factor, which produces an external reaction or response. And then it flows through a value lens. A value lens, from your description, is ethics. So I appreciate that. That's a very strong definition.
Yeah, I think it actually, in some ways, will help us further the conversation later as we dig further into critical thinking. We spend a lot of time teaching ethics at the Real Academy, and those two definitely have a lot of crossover. Well, Kevin, how about we jump further into the topic? I'm going to move my chat window out of the way here. All right, Kevin, I'm going to hand it off to you. Why don't you tell us what critical thinking is?
So critical thinking is one of those terms that absolutely gets thrown around every day when you're providing a human service, specifically in child welfare, because we get critiqued often in regards to the decisions that we make to protect children, to protect the constitutional rights of parents. And so there's literally hundreds and hundreds of decisions that are made every day in child welfare. And so this term critical thinking is something that has gained a lot of popularity over the last 10 years, connected to, number one, performance, practice performance, which oftentimes is indicated by data and reporting, right? So when we talk about a definition of critical thinking, we need to think of it, first of all, we need to shed the negativity and the stigma that our workforce is beginning to foster when we hear the term critical thinking. And we need to remind ourselves and remind our staffs that it's an objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a type of judgment. And that's why I like Matt's definition, because it's an internal process that we engage in that produces an external response, which is the behavior or the practice or the manifestation of the decision. And it is filtered through specific lenses. And in Matt's definition, it's an ethical lens, but there are various forms of ethics, right? You have the NASW Code of Ethics, you have professional counselors' ethics, you have psychological ethics. There's lots of different ethics. So we want to help you define more specifically what type of lens we use in child welfare. So those are the three main elements. It's objective analysis, evaluation of the issue that we use to use that information to form a judgment, which is that response. So there's our three essential characteristics of critical thinking or reasoning. We use the term here at the Academy, we use reasoning. Or if you're coming from a more social work specific format, then the National Council of Social Work Education states that critical thinking, they're moving away from critical thinking because of the stigma. And they're saying that we want to look at cognitive and affective processing, right? Cognitive being the brain, affective being the heart. And we want to look at that processing. So number one, it has to be objective. Characteristic number one, objective. Your emotions, biases, interpretations of such, those are set aside, and you need to look at things that are objective facts, whether they're statements or observations. The evaluation of the statements and observations, the evaluation process comes in when we begin to think through, that's that internalization. Internally, you have to have some type of filter that you're funneling this information through to come to a judgment, right? And that could be if you're from the mental health world and you're a counselor and you're assessing someone, then that filter that you're evaluating is probably from the DSM-5. If you're in child welfare, the filter that you're evaluating the information is coming from law, federal law, state law, and policy that is defining what is child maltreatment. Thirdly, the last characteristic is judgment. You're rendering a decision based on the internal evaluation, and you have gained these different filters through your experience, and that's going to become something that we talk about very specifically that's incredibly important, your experience and expertise, and the application of policy and law and things that you learn through your experiences in your profession. You filter that objectively, and you filter out your biases, how you feel personally, your belief systems, and things of that nature to render that judgment. So those are the three critical characteristics when we talk about reasoning and talk about critical thinking. Furthermore, where do these characteristics come from? Critical thinking is actually it's actually the end of the equation when we apply reasoning. Reasoning is the core of what we do as human beings. We reason. Those three characteristics come from the DIS method. Okay, so I want you, when you're critically thinking, when you're evaluating a specific situation, I want you to use DIS method. What does DIS mean? Number one, deductive reasoning, right? You remember this from school? Deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and strategic, all right? So DIS, D-I-S. Deductive starts with somewhat of a general idea, and you are becoming more specific. So you come from a generality, say that you receive a report on child maltreatment, and you get all of this information, and you move from that general context of information, and you come to a specific point, right? Vice versa, the internal processing of what's happening is the inductive. You're drawing from those general discussions and becoming more specific, right? So deductive, did I say that backwards? I might have said that backwards, didn't I? Deductive, general to specific, and inductive, specific to general statements. So when you're drawing on those specific observations, that internal filter when you're inducting helps you to use the policy, the law, or the diagnostic that you're prescribed to in your profession to render that decision. And it's strategic. Why is it strategic? It's strategic because you have to apply reasoning and logic. The strategic logic behind coming to a specific decision is not, you're just not creating a judgment ex nihilo. You're not creating it out of nothing. These are experts in the field that have prescribed to you various pathways and guidelines to help you come to that decision. So strategically, you go through the law and the policy to guide that information down into an objective point. So you're taking all that information, and you're filtering things that are irrelevant out of the way, maintaining the relevant information so that you can come to that judgment. So that's where the three characteristics come from. It comes from reasoning. Critical thinking, then, here's the equation that I want you to walk away. Reasoning, it's reasoning. Critical thinking is reasoning plus the evaluation of the information, right? Which equals the decision or the judgment. So critical thinking is actually the moving part of reasoning. It's the moving end, right? You render a decision or a judgment that you can actually create action. And the practitioner's recognition of these three characteristics translates into the skills that we use every day in the field. So there's your three characteristics. And I want you to know that that formula, that reasoning plus evaluation of the information, that's what gives you the decision and the judgment, because that's what you're going to operationalize, or that's the practice that you're going to provide next. So that's the critical thinking. So challenges in critical thinking. Okay, so I want to break this down further, because with the new information highway and the focus on big data or using data to help make change, what I've realized over the years in my study and in my practice is there are more forms of reasoning that have to be dealt with in specific manners. Because a lot of times we use all this information, right? We create these wonderful data dashboards about how we're performing. And we have all these different reports that we can use to indicate, how well a service is being provided. The issue around that is that you're only using one type of reasoning. So you're only using one type of the brain. You're only using one aspect of the human, okay? And we want to teach you to use the whole human, the whole brain. That logic that's connected to data has a couple of terms that I want you to know and learn, because there are direct impacts on the workforce here. So when we look at data reports that help us to unpack and unravel specific decisions that we see from the professionals in the field that we make, that's called risk logic or certain logic, right? So certain logic has its roots really in the field of economics, to where there have been broadcasts of how economic trends and economic growth and things of that nature, they use all of these reportings over, and I keep doing my hands like this because it's a span over time, right? They collect all this data over time to predict how the economy is going to behave next year. Think specifically about the housing market right now. When we think about risk logic and certain logic, the housing market is at an all-time boom. It is a seller's market right now. Inventory is very low in most markets, and sellers are selling houses at astronomical prices right now, and you can make more money on your house today than you could 5 years ago, 10 years ago, okay? So statistically speaking, we can see trends in the market, and we can relatively predict that this trend will not maintain itself, right? Everybody's concerned if you're in the market to buy a house or sell a house, then there's that certainty that the market will dip. Okay, that's the economic strategy. When we apply that to human services, we have to be really careful, because when you're applying that type of logic to human services, you're actually prescribing cognitive deficiencies of your workforce if you're not careful. So, Kevin, what do you mean? Well, hang on. I'm going to give you some examples of how logic and how risk and certain logic can be applied in a healthy way and in an unhealthy way, okay? Because the next aspect I want to talk about is something that's not talked about enough, are heuristics. Heuristics, typically we hear the line, okay, so here's our report, right? But that's not enough. It's not fulfilling. Well, what's the story behind the data? And I challenge that statement that it's not the story. It's not the story of what made the data. It's the person or the people that make the decisions. and that's really important, is decisions have to be personalized, especially in a human service-driven industry, because it's the people that provide the decisions. And so anything that we can use to value humanity, restore dignity in our workforce, I truly believe in the data that we've put forth here at the Real Academy demonstrates that it has a higher retention rate of our professionals. And so when we look at the lens of reasoning and critical thinking, I want you to know that there are two forms. One is risk, logic, or certainty. That's your big data. Heuristics is more personal, because now we're going to talk about how did Kevin come to the decision that he actually came to. So let's talk about risk logic specifically first, and I want to use an illustration with you.
Hey, Kevin, as you go to the illustration, I'm just curious, is there much of a divide between between risk logic and heuristics in child welfare? Like, it seems like one is really more for that like big picture kind of, like you said, big data, but then heuristics is probably more like that ground level. But do they interact? Do they complement one another?
Okay, so Ryan, I'm hearing you ask two questions actually. Number one, I think the first question was, do they interact? So the answer to that is, oftentimes we don't have them interacting enough. And the way that they interact is distal. There's a distal reaction between the two, where big data is used in an attempt to really drive change, which leaves the most important element is your human resource element, right? So there's this odd distal disconnect a lot of times in the way that we use them in continuous quality improvement or performance measures. Let me go to the example, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about an experience that I've had as a practitioner in the field. So this is a data report that is used from the CFSR. This is the federal measures that all child welfare in the United States, how we are measured, okay? And there are various aspects in those measurements. Number one is when you look at the data on your screen right now, you can see the recurrence of maltreatment, right? And inside of that, the national standard of where they want you to perform, and let me just explain recurrence of maltreatment. So in the recurrence of maltreatment, say you get a report on the Smith family, and there's an indicator of maltreatment. There's either a substantiation or a finding that maltreatment actually occurred. Within the next 12 months, if the Smith family has another report of maltreatment, and there's a positive finding for maltreatment, then that's considered by the feds repeat maltreatment. And so the feds have said, we want to reduce repeat maltreatment. Everybody that works in child welfare or in an intersecting organization, we all want to end repeat maltreatment for our children. So this is something we all believe in. And so the feds have set the standard at 9.10. And don't ask me how they've calculated 9.10 as acceptable. We'll use that for another training. So in the state of North Carolina, you can see that our performance in round 3 of the Child and Family Services Review, as a state, we're at 10.2%, okay? And medium counties, we're a county tiered system. We have low, medium, and high populated counties. We're at 10.7, so just above the entire state average. The county that I pulled here, we have 100 counties in the state of North Carolina. That's where we're broadcasting from today in North Carolina. And in this county, in the judicial district, because we have several judicial districts, we have 13.4% repeat maltreatment. Okay, and inside of that, you can see the score specifically for this county, Rutherford County. Okay, traditionally, when I was a field practitioner in child welfare, the way that reports were used, and maybe some of you experienced the exact same thing, is that your supervisor would come in, or your program manager, or your administrator, or your director would come in, and we would talk about these reports, right? Hey, our repeat maltreatment numbers are way too high. We need to get it down. Okay, so when we apply the DIS method of reasoning and logic, then we're talking about something very specific, right? And Ryan, here's the answer to your question. The challenge is how do we get there? The question that we have to answer is how do we get there? So when we're asking the right questions and how do we get there, then we know at the end of the discussion, it's the people that are making the decision in the field, right? So there are two reactions that commonly take place. Number one is to drive change by stating that we have to change the number. We're talking about the number, okay? Which creates disenfranchisement from the personal service that we provide in child welfare or human services. That's one reaction. The other reaction is to tell me the story behind the data. Why does that number exist? Both of those questions create distance between the management and the professionals that are doing the frontline service, okay? Okay, so how does it create that distance between the two? Because we're not going directly to understanding how someone made the decision. Oftentimes what happens is that we use the reports and we're trying to understand the story behind the data of how we got there. And so what do? We do case reviews. We talk to our workers after we've read their cases, right? We do case reviews, we read the dictation, we read the decisions that are formulated inside of these cases. And then as management or our state partners who are coming behind us, providing quality assurance or technical assistance, they prescribe a decision based on just what's read in the case. And oftentimes we don't have that one-to-one connection with the workforce to really go into those moments to where we can ask them solid questions about why have they made the decisions that they've made. And honestly, it's not just a singularity, right? It's decisions in child welfare are made in plurality. And so it's more of an organizational standpoint, or the worker and that supervisor or that unit that is making that decision. So when you look at big data, you can see right now, you may ask the question, well, okay, well, number one, you might be saying, well, North Carolina's not performing too bad. They're not that far off of the mark. And some of us might be thinking, wow, what are they thinking? Honestly, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in front of a supervisor with that question, Kevin, what were you thinking? Obviously, I don't know what I was thinking. And that always puts you in the pressure. Or you get asked the question, so tell me, I read your case already, and so tell me why you made that decision. Now, here's the distal point that it creates, okay? Because oftentimes, because we're not working with our workers on a regular basis with looking at cases and getting good feedback from them, that case may be reviewed. That might be a case we did last year, right? And so asking me a year later to think about what decisions I made in that specific case at that point in time is really challenging for me. So using big data to help change, on the positive side, it gives us the indicator, right? But that's really all it does. But if you try to prescribe that, that these types of reports are the judgment, is the judgment source of poor decision making, whether it's in child welfare or if it's in mental health or whatever profession you're in as a social worker. If you're prescribing that these are poor judgments based on just this report, then it can be a damaging point, a traumatic point to your workforce. Then they're going to want to look at these reports. They're not going to work with you on that, because it's always how do we improve the numbers? How do we make the benchmarks, which we have to do? But at the same time, we're not taking the time and the necessary steps to talk about how do we improve decisions, because that's what will improve the benchmarks. So when you look at these big data reports, you only see the big data numbers. You don't actually see the people doing the work. So when you're talking about risk and certain logic, then the real danger behind that, if you're trying to use these reports for change and motivation, then you're leaving out the common human element of your workers. And this is why heuristics is so important. So when we talk about heuristics, Ryan, you pull up the screen for heuristics really quick. Heuristics. Heuristics is the internal processing that we all go through, right? So those of us that we have a certain level of expertise in child welfare or in the profession that you're in. That expertise comes over time. It comes from reading the policies that govern your state or your jurisdiction's services. Understanding the laws that govern. So it's the policies that help us to interpret what is and is not maltreatment, and understanding and applying the law of what is and is not maltreatment. And then the human experience aspect of heuristics. That's when we're in the field working with the families, working with the children, there's something else that kicks in over time. You think about heuristics in the sense that, a type of data report that can only tell me certain things about a person, but it can't tell me everything about the person. That takes a one-to-one engagement. So when we think about heuristics, a fly ball heuristic is one that I like to use a lot. You think about how many of you play baseball or watched baseball and know the sport, right? So you got, how do you catch a fly ball? Do you go out on the field the first time and you just automatically start catching a fly ball because you've read a report or read instructions about how you're going to catch a fly ball? Probably not. Because there's a lot of other dynamics that are happening that cannot be included in a report or an instruction manual. When there has to be some type of understanding about how to calibrate your eyes and depth perception when the ball is hit to you. And there has to be some understanding of how you respond, how the body responds to that visual effect when the ball is hit, to help you guide yourself under the ball, position the mitt in the proper place, and even the dynamics of when the ball touches the mitt, how the hand reacts. So there's a lot of moving parts. And how do you make sure that your colleague on the field or your teammate on the field doesn't run into you, right? When you're trying to catch a fly ball. So when we talk about heuristics, or we talk about moving our conversation to a more personal level to improve making a good call in the field, heuristics is incredibly important, and it's underestimated and it's underutilized in our industry. Heuristics comes in when we look at all of this information that comes at us, and we know through the application from our experience of how to filter that information, right? Big data, a resource that I want to point you to that helps guide a lot of thinking. And if you haven't read Herbert Simon at all, I want to introduce you to this book, Administrative Behavior. If you are in a leadership position or thinking about being in a leadership position, Herbert Simon has fashioned a lot of how we approach decision-making here at Real Academy. And Simon is a Nobel laureate in economics, specifically in human reasoning and decision-making. And one of the things that Simon says about big data is that, and you're talking about an industry expert from the 80s that understood artificial intelligence before artificial intelligence became artificial intelligence. Herbert Simon said this about organizations and institutions. He said that all of the data that's coming at us creates a wealth of information and a poverty of attention. Okay? All these reports that we look at create a wealth of information and a poverty of attention. So what was Simon's cure for the poverty of attention? There's also a book that a really amazing author wrote specifically about child welfare and used stories from social workers called The Impossible Imperative, which hits at the same heart that Simon was speaking to. How do we manage all this information? because it's a wealth, it's a flooding, it's a cascade of all this information, but it creates a poverty of attention. Heuristics, we argue, helps us to attend to the attention, because all this information that comes in can span our attention and spiral us out of control in the different directions, right? Whether it's our biases or culture in an organization that we tend to think in one way or the other. The heuristics helps us to apply objective reasoning to that information. For example, if we were to take a look at a report, let me share my screen. I want to show you just a report here.
Kevin, I appreciate you just kind of addressing some of those questions that I asked before. I'm sure you probably have some ideas on how we can make the best use of big data and then communicate maybe what's needed in response to that down into, the frontline positions within social work, specifically child welfare. Our students, I just want to let you know that this is the second part of the 3-part series. And so I think we'll be able to dig into more of that probably in the next part. Wouldn't you say, Kevin?
Yeah. In the third part, what I would like to do is more workshop style to get into the details of how this practically plays out. Because big data does have good utility. Where we often are misguided in using big data is when we use it to invoke change or elicit change in a system that is rendered in a human services purview. So big data can't be used to prescribe cognitive deficiencies in the workforce. We feel that. How many of you have felt that? I just want to ask that question again. How many of you have felt the pressure or the negative impacts of how data is used in our industry to help us improve? I'm not anti-improvement. Honestly, I'm probably one of the higher advocates to change our system as a whole. Child welfare definitely needs a lot of changes. What I am trying to focus on is that human aspect. Large data sets are one indicator. Okay, that's that general, gives us a general idea of what's going on in the system. And the way we become more specific and prescriptive in our analysis or our evaluation is working more closely with the people that do the work in the field. And so we have to understand how they make decisions. And what we're putting together is that all of this information that comes in, take a look at this report. This is just a mock intake report. And some of you have seen these before, or some type of assessment where you have all this information. And part of the goal is to take this type of information, because you have a wealth of information right here in front of you, and to learn to use somewhat of a heuristic standpoint of those filters from policy and law, and call out the objective pieces that help you to determine what maltreatment is or is not. These applications help us in the field more often when we're having to make decisions on our feet and when we're observing behavior and hearing statements in the family. So when you take a look at a report like this, you can see that there's a lot going on. And over time, you can begin to really focus in on the things that are really concerning that can present harm or danger for a child. Big data reports do not get into the specifics of what we can call out in these types of moments when we're looking at a report and working with our staff. Oftentimes, big data reports don't tell us the positives of what's happening in our workforce. So when we're talking about heuristics that fly ball, there are probably folks here from different states and different jurisdictions. And so just one question I would have to show the power of heuristics is, just real quick, either by a raise of hand or drop in the chat real quick, do you see maltreatment in this report? Yes or no?
Kevin, I'm holding myself back from answering the question.
Thank you, Ryan. If you, yeah, just hold off and let our students have a moment to marinate in that and shoot us some answers. Yes or no?
We got an answer here from Amanda. She says yes, parental substance use. I definitely got that one too.
Okay. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. Give you just another minute and throw an answer in there. Be brave. And y'all can definitely tell I'm from Western North Carolina, right? The way this report's written and the way I talk.
Matt Hill jumped in here and he said, he said no, to be just to challenge you a little bit. He wants to play devil's advocate.
That never happens in child welfare. Okay, because I want to give everybody the opportunity to have some dialogue, because that's a lot to swallow in this type of lunch and learn. And I'm definitely excited. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry to interrupt, but LaQuanda, she jumped in as well, and she said, I kind of want to say no as well. So she's it looks like she's looking at it from Matt Hill's perspective a little bit. Basically, due to what she's able to see written here. So
okay,
I'll let you get back to what you were going to say.
No, this is great. This is a perfect example of how human interaction is so important in decision making, especially when it comes to heuristics. I wonder what LaQuanda would have said before hearing Matt's interpretation. So that's a question I would have for engagement.
That sounds like a red pill, blue pill thing.
Oh, no. Jeepers. Okay, we're not going to digress into red pill, blue pill situation. But part of that dynamic, right, is the influences. Remember, Simon says it's a wealth of information and a poverty of attention. A lot of things catch our attention when we're trying to make decisions. And the objective points in this report that you see, you may not see direct harm, but there's definitely danger. There's danger for this child. And I'm not sure what jurisdictions everybody is in, but there is maltreatment indicated in this report. And those are the child being specifically exposed to methamphetamine and some of the behaviors that are listed in here, because you have long-term effects that's in there. Some jurisdictions may even include injurious environment because of the level of criminal activity that the child is exposed to in this type of environment. And so I love heuristics because it engages that internal process. And so when I look at my jurisdiction, which is North Carolina, and apply the specific laws, and CAPTA would actually also help us to look at the specifics around drug endangered children, right? And so that kind of gives us that guidepost. And so for those of us that are leaning more towards that there is maltreatment indicated here, there's definitely signs of maltreatment that are indicated. So you could screen this report in, definitely.
Kevin, can I jump in real quick too? I had a thought. There was something in this statement right here that immediately got my attention. And it makes me think about your point about risk logic and then heuristics, right? Because this is an individual report that or two reports that someone received, right there on the front line. We know from the studies that we've done, looking at national statistics for the most at-risk age groups for children, and I see that this child is less than a year old. So I've got a red flag up already. Now, but that red flag's up because of the risk logic that I am aware of associated with children under the age of really 5. But I mean, less than 1 year old seems like, that just got my attention. So I just really wanted to kind of point that out. Like there's that risk logic informing me as I look at this. But to your point, I really need to implement heuristics to really balance it out. Otherwise, I'd just be like triggered right away, right?
There you go.
Maybe not triggered, but like my hairs are up. Does that make sense?
Right. You may lean more because you may lean more on screening it in for maltreatment based on the data reports. And what Ryan is referring to is the child fatality, the national child fatality here in the United States, the data. 75% of children we know that die in fatalities are less than 5 years old, and they come from neglect cases.
Yeah. And Amanda confirmed this too. I think this is something Amanda's aware of because she jumped in the chat and said, the younger, the more vulnerable.
That's right. That's right. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities in this case. So, and for those that may not see the maltreatment, you have the opportunity to call that reporter and ask more questions, right? But this is the engagement that we really want to encourage students here at the Academy to work through and process. So that's that example. So it's not, right or wrong. We're not here for right or wrong. We're here to stretch your gray matter, to think about different elements and how do you objectively recognize these elements to make a good call in the field. So, okay, so you guys have heard me talk a lot. What types of questions do you have or comments? You can unmute yourself and talk. You can type into the chat and Ryan can read it out.
Yeah, Kevin, there you go. I was going to say, stop sharing your screen so we can see each other more. Yeah, the invitation to our students, for those of you who might have missed the introduction, this is a good opportunity for us to kind of get to know each other a little bit. It's a pretty small group on the call today. But, kind of hearing where you're coming from, sharing some of your thoughts, your questions about the subject. We pretty much have the rest of the time for that. So, and if you haven't eaten, then you can get to eating.
Yeah, please don't be bashful. If there's crunching or munching in the background, we will not be offended.
We had some microwave noises going on over here on this side. You gotta microwave it for 30 seconds and then test it to see if it's hot in the middle yet, and then do it again like 5 more times. So looks like we got a question here from Matt. Matt's asking, what's the best way to flesh out bias before critical thinking? Okay, Matt's hitting all the he's hitting all the highlights. Earlier he brought up ethics, and now he's bringing up bias. Some of our favorite topics that we can talk about. Right.
Okay. So one, Matt, I want to engage in your presupposition. Well, let me point out a presupposition in the format of the statement. The format of the statement is, how do we flesh out bias before we make a decision? Okay, so what I'm going to say, in human reasoning, there's no way for you to flesh out bias before a decision is made. It's before the process, it's during the process, it's after the process. And when we talk about bias, and here at the Academy, we have courses just on bias alone. But we don't talk about just the traditional biases that are talked about regularly. I'm talking about the biases of racial inequalities, culture, belief systems, sexual orientation, things of that nature. We take it a step further and talk about other types of biases, like confirmation bias, limit resource bias, hindsight bias. We talk about how those different elements impact decision making. So bias is something that you constantly have to attend to pre, during, and after decisions. because sometimes a bias may not come up until after a decision is made and you're working with a colleague and a colleague points out that there may be something in your own rationality that was bound at the time, and presents itself as a bias. But we do have very specific techniques and tools that we have crafted here at the Academy, and we would love for you guys to learn more about that here in just a few minutes.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, that was a good question. Also, I responded in the chat with, we actually have an ebook on bias where we talk about those five most common that we see in casework that are, like you said, non-demographic type of biases. So I put that in there. It's a free resource that we like to offer students. If you're needing CEUs for your position at all, or maybe you're looking to have some kind of certification under your belt, like if you're applying for a particular position or job somewhere, these types of things are great to add to your resume. So along the lines of critical thinking, we have a critical thinking certification we offer over the course of 3 days. They're 2-hour increments each day. And it's a building block. We actually go over a tool that we created called the investigative branch. This helps caseworkers process information and really do it in an objective way. And then that leads into the good call tool. You heard Kevin talk about making good calls. We find it important to help social workers, caseworkers make good calls on their job. Everybody wants that. Everyone wants a supervisor that says, wow, Amanda or LaQuanda or Lincoln, Megan, you made a good call on that. And so that particular tool is all about setting us up and adding some confidence there. And the last one's a little bit more advanced. It's further along in the casework process. It's in the investigation process, but really developing that nexus for your case. It involves and is related to writing a narrative, and then looking ahead at potential court situations. So anyway, that's just a quick rundown of that. I'll stop sharing my screen and just let you all know that we also are excited about next month. October, if you didn't know, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And in the state of North Carolina, domestic violence, or DV, is one of our maltreatment types. And so we're going to be covering in a lunch and learn that we've been sharing about on LinkedIn, talking about the subject of domestic violence and how it is a maltreatment type, or a type of child maltreatment. And we also hope to have a more in-depth training that month as well. So just stay tuned for more things. This is our core thing that we are all about, is training social workers and making sure that they are equipped to do the work that they volunteered for, that they are using to serve their communities. So Kevin, do you have anything else you want to throw in there?
I just want to say thank you to everybody that joined us today for lunch. And we're here for you if you need anything. If you could think of any topics or ideas that would be useful for training and educating social workers, please let us know, because our mission is to build training for the people that do this work. And we position ourselves through a set of core values, and relationship is more important than anything else. We want to be relational and know what you're doing, so that the trainings that we produce, the educational items that we put out, connect directly to you and what you need in the field. So let us know. And we respond pretty quickly to those items, and can get trainings crafted and formatted and sent out to you pretty quickly.